She came with 2 children, a carpet bag, and a name she'd been promised would matter here. It didn't. The man who wrote her letters, who swore on paper that he would meet her at this station and give her a life worth having. He was gone. No note, no explanation. Just an empty platform and a Montana wind that cut straight through her coat while the whole town watched and said nothing. Clara Hayes had $31, 2 hungry children, and nowhere left to go. If you've ever started over from nothing, like this video, comment the city you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. Let's see how far Clara's journey travels. The Northern Pacific pulled into cold water just after 2 in the afternoon, and Clara Hayes was already awake. Had been awake since somewhere east of Billings, watching the sky turn the pale, washed-out gray that she was beginning to understand was just Montana's version of ordinary. Evan was asleep against her arm, his small head heavy, his mouth slightly open. He'd been quiet for most of the journey, the way he always was lately, watchful, contained, like a child who had learned early that loud feelings didn't help anything. He was 5 years old and already had the eyes of someone twice that. Clara noticed it every time she looked at him and felt the familiar ache of it, the guilt that followed her like a second shadow. Lily was in her lap, awake and restless, pulling at the buttons on Clara's coat with the single-minded focus that 3-year-olds brought to everything. She'd been asking for water for the past half hour, and Clara had been saying soon in the steady, even voice she used when she didn't actually know what was coming next. Soon, sweetheart, soon. The train slowed with the grinding shudder she'd grown used to over the past 4 days. That lurch and groan of iron fighting its own momentum. And then they were in it. Cold water. End of the line for this particular journey. Clara shifted Lily off her lap and smoothed her coat and looked out the window. The station was small, weathered boards gone silver in the way wood went out here when the seasons had worked on it long enough. A hand-painted sign hung crookedly above the door. A few men stood near the far end of the platform, smoking and talking without looking up. She scanned the platform the way she'd been scanning it in her mind for the past 2 weeks. She was looking for a man named Douglas Pratt. 38 years old, he'd written. Rancher. Steady income, good land. His letters had been careful and measured, not romantic exactly, but earnest, and she had chosen that over the alternatives, which were staying in Cincinnati, with no money and 2 children and a dead husband's debts that kept arriving in envelopes she dreaded opening. Douglas Pratt had offered her something real. That was what she'd told herself. An arrangement that was honest. A man who said plainly what he was looking for and what he could give. She had written back. They had corresponded for 3 months. She had packed everything worth keeping into a single carpet bag, sold the rest, bought 3 train tickets, and traveled 1,400 miles. The platform was empty. Not empty of people. There were people, the smoking men, a woman in a blue dress carrying a basket, a boy leading a horse along the far edge of the lot, but empty of Douglas Pratt, empty of anyone who looked like they were waiting for her. Clara sat very still for a moment. Evan had woken up during the stop and was sitting straight now, looking out the window with that careful expression. "Is this it?" he asked. "This is it," she said. "Where is he?" "He'll be along," she said, and she believed it for approximately 4 more minutes, which was how long it took her to get the children and the bag off the train and onto the platform and stand there while the other passengers moved past her. And the crowd thinned, and eventually she was the only one left standing in the center of a weathered train platform in Coldwater, Montana, with the wind pulling at her hair and Lily asking again about water. Nobody came. She waited 40 minutes. She asked the station master, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache who smelled like pipe tobacco and old coffee, whether there had been any messages left for Clara Hayes. He looked through a small wooden box on his desk with the unhurried manner of a man who had nowhere better to be. "Nothing here," he said, without particular sympathy. "Is there a telegraph office?" "Down the main street, left side. Milner's Dry Goods, then the barber shop, then the telegraph." She sent a telegram to the address Douglas Pratt had given her in his last letter. She used careful, neutral language because she was aware of the telegraph operator reading every word, and she had no interest in becoming a story for this town before she'd even gotten her footing in it. Then she took her children and her bag and sat on a bench outside the station and waited. The afternoon moved. The shadows stretched. Coldwater went about its business around her with the complete indifference of a place that had seen plenty of people arrive and plenty of people leave and had strong opinions about neither. A woman coming out of the general store across the street looked at Clara and the children and looked away quickly, the way people did when they'd registered something they didn't want to engage with. A man in a wool jacket walked past twice, slowing the second time, and Clara kept her eyes ahead and her expression neutral until he kept moving. Evan had found a loose board at the edge of the bench and was pressing it down and releasing it in a repetitive, mechanical way that meant he was anxious. Lily had fallen asleep again, her head in Clara's lap, and Clara kept one hand on her daughter's back and watched the telegraph office down the street. No one came out. By 4 o'clock, she understood that no one was going to. She went back to the telegraph office. The operator, a young man with unfortunate skin and ink-stained fingers, told her the message had been delivered to the address indicated, but there had been no response. "Could you check again?" she asked. He checked again. "No response, ma'am." She stood at the counter for a moment, doing the arithmetic in her head that she had been avoiding. $31. 3 nights at whatever the local boarding house charged if there was one. Food for 2 children. Train fare back. And back to what exactly? There was nothing in Cincinnati waiting for her. There was a landlord who had already rented the room she'd vacated. There was a sister in Philadelphia who had 3 children of her own and a husband who barely tolerated them. There was nowhere to go back to. "Is there a boarding house in town?" she asked the telegraph operator. "Mrs. Aldrich's place on Sycamore," he said. 2 blocks north, then east. She thanked him and gathered her children and her bag and walked. Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house was a 2-story white frame building that had once been painted properly and was now the color of old teeth. A porch ran across the front, and a woman was sitting in a rocking chair on it, wrapped in a heavy shawl, despite the fact that it was September and not yet cold enough to truly justify it. "I need a room," Clara said from the bottom of the porch steps, "for myself and my children, just temporarily." The woman, Mrs. Aldrich presumably, looked at her, then looked at Evan, who had stopped pressing on things and was standing very still the way he did when he was paying close attention, then looked at Lily, who had both arms around Clara's neck and her face buried against Clara's shoulder. "$1 a night," the woman said. "Meals are 50 cents. I don't allow cooking in the rooms, and I expect quiet after 8. "That's fine," Clara said, though the math had just gotten worse. "How long?" "I'm not certain yet." Mrs. Aldrich looked at her for another long moment in the assessing way of a woman who had rented rooms to strangers for a long time and had learned to read the specific varieties of trouble they came carrying. "You alone?" "I am." "What happened to your husband?" Clara had the answer ready. She'd given it enough times that it came out smooth and even. "He passed 18 months ago." A silence, then, "Room's upstairs, second door. Don't lose the key." That first night, Clara fed her children from the small supplies she'd packed. Dried biscuits, a tin of peaches she opened with the small knife she kept in her bag, and put them to bed in the narrow room with its single window facing the alley and its quilt that smelled like dust and someone else's years. She sat at the little desk in the corner with her money counted out in front of her, and ran the numbers 4 different ways and got 4 different versions of the same answer, none of which were good. She had at best 3 weeks before she was completely without resources in a town that did not know her and had given no indication it wanted to. She didn't sleep much. She lay in the dark and listened to Lily breathe the deep, even breath of small children who haven't yet learned to lie awake worrying, and she thought about Douglas Pratt and what could have happened. Death was possible, illness, an accident. But there was something in the complete silence. No message, no neighbor who'd heard anything, no word at all, that felt less like tragedy and more like intention. She'd been avoided. She didn't know yet whether he'd lied to her from the beginning or changed his mind at the last moment or simply encountered something that had made her arrival inconvenient. But the result was the same. She was here, and he was not. She spent the next 2 days carefully. She sent a second telegram, received no response. She asked Mrs. Aldrich about Douglas Pratt, keeping her voice casual, as if she were asking about the weather. The woman's expression shifted. "You're the one he sent for." "I am." Mrs. Aldrich set down the mending she was doing and looked at Clara with something that might have been pity or might have been simple calculation. "Pratt sold his property last spring, sold everything and left. Went to Oregon, I heard, though nobody knows for certain." Clara absorbed this. "He didn't mention that in his letters." "No. Mrs. Aldrich said. I don't suppose he would. Clara went back upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Then she stood up, splashed water on her face from the basin, and went back down to ask Mrs. Aldrich whether there was any work to be found in cold water for a woman who had bookkeeping experience and a decent hand. The answer was not encouraging. The general store had its own bookkeeping handled by the owner's wife. The bank didn't hire women. The school had a teacher and wouldn't need another until spring at the earliest. The hotel on the main street was managed by a man whose wife did all the secondary work and had for 20 years. What about ranches? Clara asked. Mrs. Aldrich looked at her with an expression that communicated a great deal without saying it directly. I'm asking practically, Clara said. I have experience with ledgers and record keeping, land filings, estate documents, that kind of work. I'm not asking to brand cattle. Most ranchers around here handle their own records, the woman said. Or they don't handle them at all, which is a problem of a different kind. She said it in the way of someone who had just remembered something. Then she let it drop, and Clara didn't push because she'd learned something in the past 2 days about how information moved in small towns. You didn't demand it. You waited. She waited 2 more days. On the 4th morning, she was in the small dining room at Mrs. Aldrich's, feeding Lily oatmeal and trying to convince Evan to eat his, when she heard the front door and then boots on the wood floor of the front hall, and then a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall, not dramatically so, but noticeably, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than any deliberate effort. His coat was plain and dark and had been mended at one elbow. He took his hat off when he came in, which she noted, and he looked at the room in general rather than directly at her, which she also noted. Mrs. Hayes, he said. Yes. My name's Caleb Westridge. I run a cattle operation about 8 miles west of town. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slightly. Not nervous exactly, more like someone choosing his words with care. I heard you might be looking for work. Clara looked at him steadily. Who told you that? Mrs. Aldrich mentioned it. I hope that's not out of line. What kind of work? He glanced at the children briefly, then back at her. I've got a problem with my records. Land filings, mostly. Survey documents, county registrations, a few years' worth of ledger work that was managed by a man I had to let go. It's not in good order, and I need someone who knows what they're looking at. You're offering this to a woman you've never met based on a boarding house landlady's recommendation. I'm offering it to whoever can do it, he said. If that's you, that's fine with me. Lily chose this moment to knock her oatmeal off the table. It hit the floor with the particular finality of things that couldn't be taken back. And Clara caught the bowl before it rolled and set it back on the table and looked up to find Caleb Westridge looking at Lily with an expression that was neither charmed nor irritated, just neutral, the way someone looked at a situation that was simply part of what was happening. She's 3, Clara said, as if that explained it. I have a barn cat that knocks things off every surface it can find, he said. It's annoying, but not a reason to make decisions. It was not, she thought, the worst thing anyone had said to her all week. What does the position pay? She asked. He named a figure. It was fair, not generous, but fair, and she'd learned to tell the difference. He added that there was a small room off the main house that had been used for storage, that could be cleared, that she and her children could use while the work was ongoing. For how long? She asked. Until the records are in order. Could be a few weeks, could be longer depending on what we find. He paused. I'll be straightforward with you. There are things in those records I don't fully understand, and I'd rather have someone with a clear head looking at them than continue the way I have been. What things? I'd rather show you than try to explain it, he said. She looked at him for a moment. He met her gaze without the particular quality she'd learned to recognize in men who were deciding what they wanted from you. He looked, instead, like someone who was genuinely uncertain about something and had decided to do something about it in the most practical way available. I'd need to bring my children, she said. I assumed. I'd need to be able to return to town if the situation wasn't what you described. That's reasonable? And I'd want to see the records before I agree to anything. He nodded. You can come out tomorrow morning and have a look. If it's not what you want, you go back to town and there's no obligation. Clara looked at her children. Evan watching the conversation with his usual careful attention, Lily now fully committed to pressing oatmeal into a new pattern on the table with her finger. And she thought about the money she had left, and the weeks that were left before it ran out, and what the options in front of her actually were. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll need directions." He gave them to her, clearly and without elaboration, and then he put his hat back on and left. She heard the front door close. Lily looked up from her oatmeal artwork and said something that might have been a question. "Eat your breakfast," Clara said. The road west of Coldwater was better than she'd expected. Packed dirt rather than pure mud, with the ruts of regular wagon traffic making it navigable even in the wagon she'd borrowed from Mrs. Aldrich, in exchange for a promise to return it by evening. The morning was gray and cool, and the land opened up around her in the way Montana land did, into something vast and complicated that she didn't yet have the vocabulary for. Hills that weren't mountains but suggested them, grass going golden with the season, the sky doing something dramatic with clouds that she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Evan sat beside her on the bench, watching the land with the same careful attention he brought to everything. Lily was behind them in the wagon bed, wrapped in a blanket, carrying on a conversation with a small cloth doll that Claire had stitched together from scraps during the train ride, and which Lily had named, for reasons known only to herself, Button. "Where are we going?" Evan asked. "To look at something," Claire said. "Is it going to be our house?" "I don't know yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Our old house wasn't really our house either. Father rented it." Claire kept her eyes on the road. "That's right. So it doesn't really matter, does it, whether it's ours or not?" She looked at him sideways. He was watching the horizon with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not sad, not resigned, just thinking. At 5 years old, he was already working out the geometry of how the world actually operated versus how it was supposed to. She wished he didn't have to. She didn't say so. "No," she said. "It doesn't really matter. What matters is that we have somewhere safe." He seemed to accept that. They rode the rest of the way in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the past 18 months. The silence of two people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. The Westridge Ranch announced itself first with fences, post and rail, relatively new, running parallel to the road, and then with a scatter of outbuildings, a barn that was large and in reasonable repair, a bunkhouse with a thin curl of smoke coming from its chimney, and then the main house. It was not grand. It was a practical house, 2 stories, with a porch across the front, and windows that were slightly uneven in their placement, the way houses went when they'd been added to over time rather than planned whole. Caleb Westridge was in the yard when she pulled up, talking to a hand who moved off toward the barn as she brought the wagon to a stop. "You found it," he said, which was such an obvious thing to say that she almost smiled. "I followed your directions." He helped Lily down from the wagon bed without being asked, which surprised her. Not the act itself, but the ease of it. The way he did it without ceremony or comment, just lifted her down and set her on her feet and stepped back. Lily regarded him with the frank assessment of a toddler and then turned to look at the barn. "Horse?" she said. "Several," he said. "Can I see?" He looked at Clara. She said, "After." He showed her the ranch first. Not a full tour, just the essentials. The main house, which had a kitchen and 2 main rooms and a smaller room at the back that had been used for storage. It was cluttered with boxes and old equipment and a broken chair, but it had a window that faced east and was large enough for a bed and the children's small pallet. "It's not much," he said. "It's fine," she said, because it was more than she'd had 4 days ago. Then he took her into the main room, where a large table had been cleared and stacked with papers and ledger books. She stood in front of it and looked at the volume of it. "How long has this been accumulating?" she asked. "The man who handled it before was here for 3 years. The problem started before that, I think, but that's part of what I can't sort out." Clara set down her bag and picked up the top ledger. It was a standard ranch account book, the kind that tracked expenses and income by month. And for the first 2 years it was in decent order, if not particularly meticulous. Then something shifted. The handwriting changed, became looser, and the entries became irregular. Numbers were corrected over in a way that suggested the corrections were the actual numbers, not the originals. She turned to the land section in the back and found it in worse shape. Survey references that didn't align with the book that preceded them. County filing dates that seemed off by intervals she couldn't explain yet. "What's this notation?" she asked, pointing to a set of numbers that appeared repeatedly in the margins. "I don't know," Caleb said. "That's part of why I needed someone who could look at it fresh." She put the ledger down and picked up another. And she felt the thing that happened when she was working with numbers and records and something didn't add up, a kind of alert, a sharpening. She'd felt it working as a secretary for her husband's firm in Cincinnati before he'd gotten sick, when she'd caught a discrepancy in the shipping accounts that turned out to be a junior clerk helping himself to small amounts. She'd felt it going through her husband's estate afterward, finding the debts that had been accumulated quietly while she wasn't paying attention. She felt it now. "This will take some time," she said. "I know. I'll need access to whatever you have from the county. Any original filings, any correspondence with the land office." "I have a box," he said. "I can get it. And I'll need to be able to work without interruption." He looked at the children. Evan had found a corner and was examining a set of old surveying tools with quiet fascination. Lily had attached herself to Claire's coat again. "I can ask one of the hands to keep an eye on them, if that would help." "I'd rather they stay with me," she said, "at least until—" She stopped. Until what? Until she trusted this place. Until she understood what she'd walked into. At least for now. He nodded like that was a completely reasonable thing to say and didn't push it. They settled on terms that afternoon. She would begin immediately, with room and board in exchange for the records work, and a weekly wage to be paid on Fridays regardless of progress. He wrote it down, which she'd asked for, and signed it, and she signed it, and they shook hands in the kitchen of a ranch house 8 miles from Coldwater while Lily ate a biscuit that one of the ranch hands had produced from somewhere, and Evan continued his silent examination of surveying tools. That evening, after the children were asleep on their pallet in the cleared storage room, which was already better than the boarding house, simply by virtue of being warmer and quieter, Clara sat at the main table with a lamp and the first of the ledgers and began working through it properly. She worked for 2 hours. By the end of the first hour, she had confirmed what she suspected. The irregularities weren't random. They were consistent, deliberate. The marginal notation she'd flagged appeared in a pattern that corresponded to specific land parcels, and the survey references that didn't align with earlier records did so in a way that wasn't accidental incompetence. Someone had been systematically altering the documentation. She sat back and looked at the lamp for a moment. She was a woman with 2 children and $31, 27 now, after the boarding house, in a town that had already decided she was a problem and a ranch she'd known for 6 hours, working through papers that were beginning to suggest something far larger and more dangerous than bad bookkeeping. She thought about getting up, going to wake the children, packing the bag, leaving before morning. She thought about it seriously, the way you thought about things when the alternative wasn't safe. And then she thought about what the alternative actually was. The road back to Coldwater, the boarding house, the money running out, Evan's face when she told him they were moving again. She picked up the ledger and kept working. Outside, the Montana night was big and cold and full of wind, and the ranch was quiet except for the distant sound of cattle and the creak of the house settling around her and the small, steady sound of her children breathing in the next room. She turned a page and found the next entry and the one after that, and the numbers kept not adding up in ways she was beginning to understand were not accidental at all. And somewhere underneath the fear and the exhaustion and the careful accounting of how much trouble she might be in, there was the same sharpening feeling she always got when the pieces started coming together. She was going to figure this out. She didn't know yet what it would cost her. She found the first real discrepancy on a Wednesday, 3 days into the work. It wasn't the largest thing she would find. She didn't know that yet. But it was the first one that stopped her cold. The first one where she sat back in her chair and looked at the page for a long time without writing anything down. The lamp had burned low. The children were asleep. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in the barn, and the walls of the house did their usual settling commentary against the night wind. The entry was from March of 1879. A survey reference, Parcel 14, Section 9, Township 12. Recorded in the ledger as having been filed with the county recorder's office on the 14th of that month. Standard enough. The problem was the original survey document she'd pulled from the box Caleb had given her, which showed the same parcel recorded on the 22nd. 8 days later. A gap that small could have been clerical. A man writing down the wrong date. A filing that took longer than expected to process. Except that the ledger recording was in different handwriting from the survey document. The survey was in a precise, cramped script she'd seen in the earlier records, which she believed was the original ranch hand who'd managed the books before the man Caleb fired. The ledger entry was in the looser hand that started appearing around the middle of 1878, the altered hand she'd begun to call it in her notes, because she was fairly certain now that the same person was responsible for all the irregularities. 8 days, different hands, the same parcel number, same section, same township, but the dates didn't match. And the boundary description in the ledger entry was not identical to the boundary description in the survey document. 3 words were different, 3 words that shifted the eastern edge of the parcel by what she estimated, based on the survey scale she'd found folded at the bottom of the box, to be somewhere between 40 and 60 feet. 40 to 60 feet of Montana ranch land. Not a dramatic distance. Not the kind of thing you'd necessarily notice from horseback, unless you knew what you were looking for. She wrote it down in her own notebook, the one she'd bought at the general store in Coldwater on her second day in town, which was now getting full. And she noted the parcel number and the discrepancy and the 2 different dates, and she drew a small asterisk next to it, because it matched 3 other parcel references she'd flagged earlier in the week with similar small inconsistencies, and because things that matched each other were never an accident. She closed the ledger at midnight and went to bed and lay awake for an hour thinking about it. In the morning, she said nothing to Caleb about what she'd found. This was not deception. She simply had a rule about conclusions, which was that you didn't draw them until you had enough evidence that the conclusion drew itself. What she had so far was a pattern. Patterns could be coincidence. She needed more. She worked through that Thursday with the children arranged around her in the ways that had evolved naturally over the first week. Evan had discovered that the bookshelves in the main room contained a collection of survey maps from the 1860s and early 1870s, and he spent most of his time with these spread out on the floor, tracing the lines with his finger, occasionally asking her questions she had to stop and think about. Lily moved between the table where Clara worked and the kitchen, where a ranch cook named Pete had accepted her presence with the stoic resignation of a man who understood that some things simply happened to you and there was no use fighting them. Pete was somewhere north of 50, with a limp from an old break that hadn't healed quite right, and the habit of talking to himself while he cooked in a low, continuous murmur that wasn't intended for anyone else. He had produced, on the second morning, a small square of cornbread for Lily without being asked and without comment, and Lily had accepted it with the gravity of a transaction she considered fair. And after that, they had a relationship of sorts, Lily appearing at the kitchen threshold each morning, Pete producing something without looking up from the stove. Clara had not thanked him because she sensed it would embarrass him. Instead, she had fixed a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet door that had been banging in the draft. And he had not thanked her either, and they understood each other. Caleb she saw in the mornings and evenings, at meals, and occasionally when he came through the main room to get something and stopped briefly to ask how the work was going. She gave him honest answers, which were mostly some version of still finding things, without specifying what she was finding, because the picture was still incomplete. He didn't push her. That was something. He was not easy to read. She'd noted that in the first days and found it remained true. He wasn't cold exactly, but he was contained in a way that reminded her of men who had learned that expressing what they were thinking got them into trouble and had stopped doing it. He worked long hours, came in tired, ate without ceremony, and turned in early. When he spoke, it was direct. He didn't waste words on things that didn't need saying, which she respected, even if it made him difficult to know. She learned small things, the way you learn small things about people when you lived in close proximity. He took his coffee without sugar, but with a significant amount of it. He wore the same coat every day, but kept it clean. He had a habit of standing in the doorway of the barn in the mornings, just looking out at the land for a few minutes before the day started, which she saw once when she got up early with Lily, and it had struck her as a private thing, and she had looked away. On Friday, he paid her, as agreed, and she folded the money and put it in the inside pocket of her coat and felt the particular relief of someone who has been managing on nothing and has suddenly been given a small margin. Not security, just margin. The difference between one bad thing being survivable and not. That evening, with the children already down, she sat at the table with the full run of the ledgers arranged chronologically and the county documents laid out beside them, and she went back to the beginning. She was looking for the origin point. Every deliberate pattern had an origin point, a first occurrence, before the person doing it had fully committed to the system, when the alterations were messier or less confident. She'd learned that from the Cincinnati shipping discrepancy, where the first theft had been done sloppily and everything after it more carefully, which meant the first one was the one that told you the most. She found it in a ledger from the spring of 1877. It was a land filing, Parcel 7, Section 4, which was in the northeast corner of the Westridge property. And the date discrepancy here was larger than the others. Not 8 days, but 3 weeks. 3 weeks between the date recorded in the ledger and the date on the original county filing. And the boundary description change was larger too. Not 40 feet, but closer to 200, shifting the northern edge of the parcel in a way that brought it closer to the adjacent property, which, she checked, was listed in the county records as belonging to a company called Western Meridian Holdings. She didn't know that name. She wrote it down. She found it again 2 pages later, and again in a document from 1878. Western Meridian Holdings appeared 6 times in the materials she had, always as an adjacent or boundary-adjacent property owner, always in connection with parcel records that had been altered in some way. By 10 o'clock, she had a headache that started behind her left eye and was working its way toward the back of her skull, and she had 4 pages of notes, and she had a theory she didn't like. She sat at the table and looked at the lamp and thought about it. Someone had been systematically altering the Westridge property boundaries. Not eliminating them, not yet, but moving them, incrementally, in the direction of land held or claimed by Western Meridian Holdings. Small adjustments, spread over years, consistent enough to establish a paper record that would, at some point, be used to argue that the actual boundary was not where Caleb's original document said it was. It was slow. It was patient. It was the kind of fraud that required years to set up and didn't pay off until it was complete. And it had been going on inside this ranch, in these ledgers, without Caleb knowing. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she told Caleb she needed to talk to him. He was in the yard when she found him, replacing a fence post that had rotted through at the base. He had the old post out and was tamping the new one into the hole with the efficient movements of someone who had done this enough times that it didn't require his full attention. He looked up when she came out. "Problem?" he said. "I need to show you something." He finished tamping the post, knocked the dirt off his gloves, and followed her inside. She had the relevant documents laid out on the table in the order she'd worked them out. Not every piece of paper, just the key ones. The ones that told the story cleanly without requiring him to work through her entire process. She stood to the side and let him look. He was quiet for a while. He picked up the ledger with the 1877 entry and looked at it, then at the county filing beside it. Then he looked at the table of discrepancies she'd written out in her own hand. "How many?" he said. 11 confirmed, possibly more. I haven't finished the 1880 and 1881 records. And this company?" He tapped the paper where she'd written Western Meridian Holdings. "You know who they are?" "Not yet. They appear in your county border records as an adjacent property holder, but I'd need to look at the county land office records to know more about them, who filed, when, where they're incorporated." He set the ledger down carefully, which was not the reaction she'd expected. She'd expected something more, anger maybe, or disbelief. What she got was a kind of stillness that looked less like calm and more like a man containing something he wasn't ready to express yet. "I had a hand named Roy Garrett," he said, "managed the records in some of the general ranch operations. I let him go last winter." "What was the reason?" "Money going missing from the operating account. Not large amounts, small, regular ones. I couldn't prove it cleanly enough to go to the sheriff, but I had enough to tell him to pack his things." "Do you know where he went?" "I assumed he left the territory. He had a cousin in Wyoming, I think." Clara looked at the papers on the table. "He may have been working for someone. The alterations follow a pattern that suggests a specific goal, that moving your boundary records to align with this company's claims. That's not something a ranch hand does on his own initiative. Someone directed this, and someone paid for it." Caleb was quiet again. She could see him working through it. "Roy was here for 3 years, he said finally, starting in 78. The first alteration you found is from 77, which means either he was working with someone who had access to your records before him, or he altered the 1877 entry retroactively, which is possible. The physical condition of the paper in that entry is consistent with it being handled more recently than the surrounding pages." She paused. "The ink oxidizes differently over time. The 1877 entry looks like it was written closer to 1879. He looked at her. "You can tell that?" I worked in a law firm before I was married. Document disputes. It becomes something you notice. He picked up his hat from the chair where he'd put it and turned it in his hands, the same way she'd seen him do the first day at the boarding house. Thinking, what do you need to take this further? Access to the county land office in Coldwater. I need the original filings for Western Meridian Holdings, formation documents, property registrations, anything that shows who's behind it. I can take you in tomorrow. I'd also want to talk to whoever keeps the survey records. I need to know whether the alterations in your ledgers are reflected in the official county copies or whether they're only in yours. If they're in the county copies too, then someone inside the land office was part of it, she said, or they were given falsified documents and filed them without knowing they were false. He absorbed this. And if it's the first one, then it's a larger problem than one ranch. The kitchen was quiet. From outside came the sound of Pete whistling something tuneless near the bunkhouse, and the distant low sound of cattle, and Lily talking to Button in the storage room. The ordinary sounds of a place going about its day, while something underneath it held still and complicated. Clara, Caleb said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed it. You came out here to organize ledgers, he said. He stopped. This is something different. Yes, she said. I don't want you to feel obligated. She looked at the papers on the table, at the 4 pages of notes she'd made, at the systematic, patient thing that had been done to this ranch over years by people who had never expected anyone to look closely enough to find it. She thought about obligation, what that word meant and what it didn't. I'm not working out of obligation, she said. I'm working because I found something and I want to know what it is. He looked at her for a moment, and the way she was beginning to understand was how he looked when he didn't have words for what he was thinking. Then he put his hat on and said he'd have the wagon ready at 8 in the morning. He went back outside. She sat down at the table and picked up the next ledger. The county land office in Coldwater was a narrow room attached to the back of the courthouse building, separated from the main clerk's office by a door with a frosted glass panel. The man behind the desk was named Horace Pell, 50s, thinning hair, with the slightly harried manner of a man responsible for a great deal of paper and not enough staff. He looked at Clara and then at Caleb with the particular expression county officials reserved for situations they weren't sure they had a procedure for. We'd like to look at the original survey filings for several parcels on the West Ridge property, Caleb said, and I'd like to see whatever records you have for a company called Western Meridian Holdings. Pell's expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something in it shifted, a slight tightening around the eyes, quickly controlled. What's the nature of the inquiry? Property boundary verification, Clara said. She'd decided on the way into town that direct was better than elaborate, because elaborate gave people time to think about what to withhold. We found discrepancies in the ranch records and we're checking them against your originals. That's a fairly routine request, Pell said, in a tone that suggested it wasn't. Yes, Clara agreed pleasantly. He produced the survey records after a 15-minute delay that she didn't believe was about locating files. The room wasn't that large and the filing system was clearly organized by section and township. She used the time to look at what was visible on his desk and in the open shelves behind him without appearing to, which was a skill she'd developed in the law firm and found regularly useful. She found what she needed in the survey records within 20 minutes. 3 of the West Ridge parcel filings showed boundary descriptions that matched the altered versions in the ranch ledgers, not the originals, which meant someone had filed the falsified documents with the county, and the county had accepted and recorded them. The Western Meridian Holdings records were less forthcoming. Pell produced a thin folder containing a property registration from 1878 and a subsequent filing from 1880. The formation documents, the company's original incorporation papers, were not in the folder. The formation documents would have been filed with the Territorial Secretary's office, Pell said when she asked. In Helena, Caleb said. In Helena, Pell confirmed, without looking at Caleb. Clara noted the absence of the documents and noted Pell's manner and wrote down the specific parcel numbers from the Western Meridian Holdings filings. She thanked Pell, who accepted this without warmth, and they left. On the board sidewalk outside, Caleb said, He knows something. Or he did something, Clara said, but we don't have enough yet to know which. She had found, in the thin Western Meridian Holdings folder, one detail that Pell probably didn't realize she'd noticed, A handwritten note in the margin of the 1880 filing, a set of initials, and a name she'd written down in her notebook as quickly and unobtrusively as she could. The initials were GW. The name beside them was a Chicago address. She didn't know yet what GW stood for, but the Chicago address was a starting point, and starting points were what you needed when you were working from the outside of something toward its center. She needed to get to Helena. She needed the formation documents. She thought about this on the ride back to the ranch, with Caleb quiet beside her and Lily asleep in the wagon bed and Evan watching the road ahead. And she thought about how a woman with 2 children and a weekly wage that was still catching up to her initial deficit was going to get to Helena and back without losing either the time or the thread of what she was building. She was still thinking about it when they got back, and she went inside and found that Pete had made a pot of something that smelled like vegetable stew. And Lily woke up from the wagon bed and immediately demanded to know if Button had been left in the house. And Evan said that he thought Section 4, Township 12 on the old maps looked different from what the new survey said, and could he show her? She sat with him at the kitchen table while Pete ladled out the stew, and Evan spread one of the old survey maps next to the current county copy she'd brought back. And his small finger traced the difference he'd seen with the confidence of someone who'd been looking at these long enough to know what didn't match. He was right. She looked at him for a moment. This quiet, careful boy who had come across 1,400 miles of country without complaining, who read survey maps at 5 years old because they were what was available, and he was the kind of person who engaged with whatever was in front of him. And she felt the complicated thing she always felt when she looked at him, which was love and grief and a fierce, complicated protectiveness that had no clean name. "Good eye," she said. He looked pleased in the careful way he allowed himself. "It's not the same line." "No," she said. "It isn't." She put the maps aside and made him eat his stew, and she ate hers, and Lily ate approximately a quarter of hers and negotiated unsuccessfully for more cornbread. And the evening moved toward night in the way evenings did on the ranch. The light changing outside the windows, the hands coming in and going to the bunkhouse, Caleb coming in last from whatever he'd needed to check on, washing his hands at the kitchen basin, sitting down at the table without ceremony. Pete had left his bowl and gone to his room. It was just the 4 of them at the table, and Clara was aware of the specific quality of that, the particular domestic shape of it, which was not something she'd planned and which she didn't entirely know what to do with. "I need to go to Helena," she said, while there was still stew in her bowl to look at. "To the Territorial Secretary's office. I need the Western Meridian formation documents." Caleb said nothing for a moment. "When?" "As soon as reasonable." "That's a 2-day trip each way." "I know." He was quiet, and she looked up and found him looking at the children, not with the calculating look of someone assessing inconveniences, but with the specific look of someone thinking through logistics. "I can make arrangements," he said. "Pete can watch the children during the days if you're agreeable to that. I'd ride with you. I have business at the Land Commission anyway that I've been putting off. I don't need an escort." "I know," he said evenly, "but it's a long road and the weather's changing and I have my own reasons for the trip." He looked at her directly. 2 sets of eyes are better than one going through those records, and I know the Territorial Land Commission people. They'll take longer to produce documents for a woman traveling alone than they will with a property owner present. She didn't like the fact that this was probably true. She said so. "I don't like it either," he said, "but it's what's true." She looked at Evan, who had finished his stew and was sitting with his hands in his lap, following the conversation with his usual careful attention. She looked at Lily, who had fallen asleep in her chair with her cheek on her arm, in the abrupt way of small children who simply ran out of waking at unpredictable moments. She looked back at Caleb. "Monday morning," she said. "Monday," he agreed. She cleared the table and settled Lily without waking her all the way, and Evan helped carry bowls to the kitchen with the seriousness of a child who understood that helping was the thing he could do. And Pete appeared from nowhere to take them without comment. And outside the Montana night came down cold and clear and enormous. In the main room, before she went to bed, she spent another hour with the papers. The Chicago address from Pell's margin note, the shifted boundary lines, the patient, years-long adjustment of documents in the direction of something she could almost see the shape of now, but not quite yet. GW Chicago. Western Meridian Holdings. Incorporated somewhere. operating quietly through county filings in a territory far enough from Chicago that no one had thought to look carefully until a woman with no better options sat down with a lamp and a ledger and started from the beginning. She turned the lamp down and went to check on her children one more time before she slept, the way she did every night, the way she suspected she would do for the rest of her life, regardless of what changed around her. Evan was on his back with his arms straight at his sides, already deep under. Lily had managed to get buttoned between her cheek and the pillow, which meant the doll would be slightly misshapen in the morning and require what Lily called fixing, which meant handing it to Clara to be smoothed back into shape. She stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. Then she went to bed, and for the first time in 2 weeks, she slept all the way through until morning. They left before sunrise on Monday. Pete had been up before them. Clara heard him in the kitchen when she was getting the children into their coats, the specific sound of someone moving around a small space with long practice, not trying to be quiet exactly, but not making unnecessary noise either. He'd put coffee on and left cornbread wrapped in cloth on the table without being asked. Clara had stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at it, and then had taken a piece for Lily and left the rest. Caleb had the wagon ready in the yard. He'd added a canvas cover over the bed for weather, which she appreciated because the sky to the northwest had that flat, non-committal look that she'd learned in her 2 weeks here meant something was coming, though not necessarily soon. He was checking the horse's harness when she came out with Lily on her hip and Evan walking close beside her, and he looked up and said, "Ready?" And she said yes, and they went. She sat on the bench beside him, and Lily fell back asleep against her arm within the first mile. And Evan sat in the wagon bed behind them with a surveying guide he'd borrowed from the shelf in the main room, which he was reading with the focused concentration of a child who had decided this was what he was interested in now and intended to be thorough about it. The sky lightened slowly, going from black to that particular dark blue that preceded the actual dawn, and the road stretched ahead of them pale and straight into the hills. For the first hour, they didn't talk much. She found this was something she'd grown accustomed to about traveling with Caleb Westridge. He didn't fill silence the way a lot of people did. He let it be what it was, which was just space between words, and he seemed to understand that she wasn't being distant when she didn't fill it either. It was different from the silences she'd had with her husband, which had often carried weight and implication. This was simpler, just two people going somewhere with a shared purpose who happened not to have anything particular to say at 5 in the morning. Around the second hour, when the sun had come fully up and the land was doing the thing it did in morning light, going gold and then amber and then something she didn't have a precise word for, a specific Montana quality of illumination that made everything look simultaneously vast and exact. She said, "Tell me about Western Meridian Holdings." He glanced at her. "I don't know much about them." "What do you know?" "Name came up 2 years ago. One of my neighbors, Bert Callahan, runs a place east of mine, been there longer than anyone in the county. He mentioned that someone was buying up adjacent lots. Said they'd approached him once through a lawyer out of Billings. Made him an offer on a strip of his north pasture, said it was a surveying discrepancy that needed to be remedied." "What did he say?" "He told the lawyers to get off his land." The corner of Caleb's mouth moved in what might have been amusement. "Bert's not a man who entertains remedies from strangers." "But the approach was through a Billings lawyer." "That's what he said." "I didn't think much of it at the time. Land disputes in Montana aren't uncommon. Someone always thinks they own something someone else has been sitting on for 20 years. Did you ever hear the name Whitmore?" She watched him when she said it. GW from the county office margin note had been in her mind since Saturday, and she'd spent Sunday afternoon with the 1880 Western Meridian filing trying to work backward from the Chicago address. He was quiet for a moment. "Once, in a conversation with the county assessor, maybe a year and a half ago, he mentioned investors from back east who were interested in Montana land. Said one of them was a man named Whitmore." He paused. "I didn't connect it to anything. It was a passing comment." "Gideon Whitmore," Clara said. "That's my best guess for the GW in the margin note at the county office. If I'm right, he's the principal behind Western Meridian Holdings, and he's operating out of Chicago." Caleb looked at the road. "What does a Chicago investor want with Montana cattle land?" "That's what we're going to find out." What they found in the territorial secretary's office in Helena was both more and less than she'd hoped. The The secretary's office occupied the ground floor of a building 2 blocks from the Capitol, staffed by 3 clerks who managed a volume of paper that their filing system was clearly inadequate for. The clerk who helped them was a young man named Aldous, with wire-rimmed glasses and ink on his left cuff, who responded better to Caleb's presence than she would have liked, but who was, once he understood what she was actually asking for, efficient enough about locating it. The Western Meridian Holdings formation documents were in a folder that was thicker than the county version by several pages. Clara stood at the clerk's counter and read through them with the same practiced speed she'd developed reading legal documents, noting the relevant details and copying the key ones into her notebook. Western Meridian Holdings had been incorporated in the Montana Territory in March of 1877, the same year as the earliest altered boundary record on the West Ridge Ranch. The listed principals were 4 names she didn't recognize, 2 of them Montana residents, 2 listed with Chicago addresses. The attorney of record was a man named Arthur Crane with a Billings office address, the same Billings lawyer who'd approached Bert Callahan. The Chicago addresses for the 2 out-of-territory principals were different from each other. One was a business address on LaSalle Street. The other was a residential address on Michigan Avenue. G. Whitmore was listed under the Michigan Avenue address. First name Gideon, as she'd guessed. Occupation listed as land investment and development. She wrote all of it down. Then she asked Aldous whether there were any subsequent filings connected to Western Meridian Holdings, any property acquisitions, any legal disputes, any name changes or amendments. There were 2 subsequent filings. The first was from 1879, adding a 5th principal to the company, another Chicago name. The second was from 1881, just this past spring, and it was not an addition, but a revision to the company's stated property holdings, which now listed, among other Montana parcels, a strip of land along the northeastern edge of the West Ridge Ranch, a strip of land that included Parcel 7, Section 4, Township 12. The parcel Evan had spotted on the old map, the one with the altered northern boundary. Clara read the 1881 filing twice. Then she set it down on the counter with deliberate care. "They've already filed the claim," she said quietly. Caleb was at her shoulder, reading over it. "They're claiming land I own. They're claiming land that the altered records say they own. If your county filings show the boundary in the wrong place, and their 1881 filing says the land on the other side of that boundary is theirs." She stopped. "Then on paper," he said, in the voice of someone working through something he hadn't wanted to be true, "it already belongs to them." "Not yet. There's a process. They'd have to bring a legal action, present their evidence, give you the opportunity to dispute it. But if the only records available are the ones Roy Garrett altered, your ability to dispute it is significantly limited." Aldous the clerk had moved discreetly to the far end of the counter and was attending to something else with the carefully blank expression of a man who was absolutely listening. Caleb said, lower, "Can we get copies of these?" "All of them," she said. "I need the 1877 formation documents, the 1881 revision, and any correspondence in the file." There was correspondence. 3 letters filed with the 1881 revision between Arthur Crane, the Billings lawyer, and the secretary's office, requesting confirmation of the revised property boundaries. Standard in form. Polite. Written on expensive stationery with an embossed letterhead. She copied the key passages in her notebook and had Aldous make official copies of the filing documents, which required Caleb's signature as the adjacent property owner, and a fee she paid from her own pocket because Caleb had left his in the wagon and she wasn't waiting. They were back on the street by early afternoon. "The 1874 survey," Clara said, while they walked back toward where they'd left the wagon. Lily had woken up from the morning sleep and was walking between them, holding Clara's hand, looking at Helena with the particular attention of a child experiencing a new place. Evan was beside Caleb, still carrying his surveying guide. "You mentioned it when I asked about the original property documents. You said there was an 1874 state survey. My father had it when he established the ranch. I have the original somewhere in the house. I haven't looked at it in years. We need to find it when we get back." She thought while they walked, working through the sequence. The 1874 survey would predate everything, the company formation, Roy Garrett, all the alterations. If the boundaries in that document match your original deed, and both of those contradict what Western Meridian has filed, Then you have documentary evidence of a deliberate falsification that goes back to 1877. Is that enough to stop a legal action? It's enough to start one of your own, and it's enough to bring to federal attention because what's been done here? Falsifying county filings, manipulating land records across a county, potentially bribing or corrupting a county official, that's not a local dispute. That's federal land fraud territory. He was quiet for half a block. You sound very certain. I'm certain about the documents, she said. I don't know yet how much further it goes, or how many other ranches they've worked this way, or whether the county recorder's office is actively complicit or just negligent. Those are questions for the federal land office, not for us. But you think it's more than one ranch? I think a man who spent 4 years setting up a fraud this systematic, through a company with multiple principals and a dedicated legal representative, is not doing it for one parcel on the northeast corner of one cattle ranch. She glanced at him. I think your ranch was a target, and probably not the only one. He looked at the street ahead. Something in his expression had gone very flat and contained, the way it did when he was thinking things he wasn't ready to say. They found a hotel for the night. A practical decision given the hours and the children, and she was grateful he didn't make it complicated. He took one room, she took another with the children, and they agreed to meet for supper at 7. She spent the hour before supper at a table in her room with the copies she'd obtained and her notebook, organizing what they had into a sequence that would hold up to scrutiny. She was thorough about this because she understood that thorough was the only way this worked. Documents were only as useful as their arrangement. A box of loose papers proved nothing. A coherent chronology with consistent corroborating evidence told a story that couldn't be argued away. She had the altered ranch ledgers, documented with dates and specific discrepancies. She had the county survey filings that matched the altered versions. She had the Western Meridian formation documents and the 1881 revision claiming Westridge land. She had the Billings lawyer's correspondence. She had the initials in the margin of the county filing, attributable to Gideon Whitmore. What she didn't have was the direct link, the payment, the instruction, the piece of evidence that put Whitmore's name not just adjacent to the fraud, but inside it. She needed Roy Garrett, or she needed the 1874 survey, which would be clean enough to anchor everything else. She put her notebook away when Lily started complaining about hunger, with the focused insistence that indicated she was done waiting. She washed both children's faces over the basin, straightened Evan's collar, let Lily carry Button to dinner because it wasn't a battle worth having, and went downstairs. Caleb was already at the table, and there was a man with him. She slowed at the bottom of the stairs, assessing. The man was somewhere around 60, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now just substantial. He was dressed well, not extravagantly, but carefully, the way men dressed when they understood that presentation carried information. He was talking when she came in, and he stopped when Caleb looked up. "Clara," Caleb said, with something slightly careful in his voice. "This is Martin Hale. He's an investigator. Was one before he retired, with the General Land Office." Hale stood, which she noted, and extended his hand. "Mrs. Hayes." She shook it. "You're retired?" "Consulting basis now," he said, with the slight self-deprecation of a man who had told this story enough times it had lost its friction. "I live in Helena. Caleb and I have known each other some years. When he sent word he was coming to town, I came to find out why." "Caleb sent word?" Caleb said, "I sent a telegram Saturday before we left. I wanted Martin to know what we'd found before we arrived." He met her gaze steadily. "I should have mentioned it." She sat down and settled Lily on the chair beside her and looked at her soup and made a decision about whether to be annoyed about this. Caleb had contacted this man without telling her. That was a breach of the kind of working trust she thought they'd established. She was also sitting across from a retired General Land Office investigator who had heard what they'd found and come to dinner, which meant he thought it was worth his time. "What did he tell you?" she asked Hale. "Enough," Hale said. "Western Meridian Holdings, Gideon Whitmore." He picked up his coffee. "We've heard that name before." She looked at him. "We, former colleagues. There was an inquiry in Wyoming 3 years ago, a similar pattern, land boundary manipulations, a holding company with Chicago backing. The investigation stalled, the evidence wasn't sufficient, the principal was well insulated, and a key witness withdrew his cooperation. He set the coffee down. The company involved in that inquiry was dissolved before charges could be brought. And Western Meridian is not that company, but the methodology is consistent enough that people who look at these things have been paying attention. He looked at Clara directly. "What do you have?" She told him. Not everything. She held back the specific details of what was in her notebook until she understood better who Hale was and what consulting basis meant in practice. But enough. The chronology, the boundary alterations, the 1877 formation date, the 1881 claim filing. He listened without interrupting, which she respected. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The 1874 survey," he said. "If it exists and the boundaries are clean, that's significant. I believe it exists. I haven't seen it yet. If you can produce it, combined with the formation documents and the altered county records, you have the foundation of a federal complaint." He paused. "I'd want to see the documentation myself before saying anything stronger than that." "You'd be willing to review it," Caleb said. "I'd be willing to tell you what a federal investigation would need and whether what you have gets you there." Hale looked at Clara. "Who organized this?" "I did." "All of it? The discrepancy identification, the chronology, the county and territory filings?" "Yes." He looked at her in the direct, assessing way of someone recalibrating what he'd expected to find. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "what did you do before Montana?" "Law firm work," she said. "Document management. And then my husband's estate, which required similar skills under less pleasant conditions." He nodded once, slowly. "I'd like to see your notes." "When we returned to the ranch," she said, "and after I found the 1874 survey." It was as close to a negotiating position as she could manage over soup in a Helena hotel dining room with Lily trying to feed Button a piece of bread roll, and he accepted it without argument, which told her he was serious rather than simply curious. They left Helena the next morning. The return trip was longer, or felt longer, with the weight of what they'd confirmed sitting in the wagon alongside the children and the food supplies Caleb had picked up at a dry goods store and the 3 official document copies she'd folded carefully into her notebook. About halfway back, when Evan was asleep in the wagon bed and Lily was occupied with a stick she'd picked up at the last stop and was using to point at things out of the wagon, Caleb said, "I should have told you about Martin." "Yes," she said. "I wasn't trying to go around you. I knew him before I knew what you'd find, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it was useful to have someone who knew the federal process before we went in there." "It was useful," she said. "That's not the same as it being the right way to handle it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right." She looked at the road. "If we're doing this together, and I think we are because this is your property and my evidence and we need both, then I need to know what you know when you know it." "Fair," he said. "And I need to be in the room for conversations that concern this, not told afterward." "Understood." She didn't say anything else about it. He didn't either. The road went on ahead of them, and the sky was doing the dramatic cloud arrangement again, and she thought about the 1874 survey somewhere in the ranch house, in a box or a trunk or between the pages of some other document, and how much depended on finding it and finding it intact. They got back to the ranch late afternoon. Pete had apparently managed the children's absence with his usual equanimity. The kitchen was clean, there was something on the stove, and a note on the table in Pete's cramped handwriting that said, "Only fence on East Line cut again," and the date. Clara read the note. Caleb read it over her shoulder. "Again?" she said. "It happened once while you were still at Mrs. Aldrich's," he said. 3 posts cut on the eastern boundary. I assumed it was someone passing through, kids maybe. It happens." His voice had gone flat. "It's not kids." "No," she said. "It isn't." She put Lily down to play and set Evan up at the table with his surveying guide and went with Caleb to find the 1874 survey. They found it in the second place they looked, a wooden document box at the back of a closet in what had been his father's room, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it well enough that the paper inside, though yellowed, was intact and fully legible. It was a large format document, official territorial issue, with the boundary descriptions written in the formal notation of the period, and a set of surveyor's measurements along the edges. She laid it on the main room table and found the northeast corner. Parcel 7, Section 4, Township 12. The northern boundary was clearly described. She measured it against the survey scale and cross-referenced with Evan's observation about the map discrepancy and the county filing and the Western Meridian claim. The original 1874 line was 212 feet north of where Western Meridian Holdings claimed the boundary sat. 212 feet of grazing land, timber, and water access that had been Westridge land for over a decade, and that someone had spent 4 years moving on paper until it was no longer legally visible. She stood back from the table and looked at the document and felt the thing that came with the end of a long search. Not triumph, exactly, because there was too much still ahead for that, but a kind of solidity. The ground coming up under your feet after a long time of not knowing where solid was. "Is it enough?" Caleb said from behind her. "It's the anchor," she said. "Everything else hangs from this." She was still looking at the survey when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard, and then boots on the porch, and then a knock on the door that was not the knock of someone who expected to be turned away. Caleb went to the door. The man on the porch was somewhere in his 40s, wearing a suit that had no business being in Montana, and carrying a leather satchel that explained why he'd come. Clara stood at the edge of the main room doorway and looked at him and recognized immediately the specific variety of man he was, the deliberate presentation, the formal politeness worn like a tool. A lawyer. "Mr. Westridge," the man said, "my name is Theodore Crane. I represent Western Meridian Holdings. I'm here to discuss a matter of property boundaries that my client believes can be resolved without the need for formal legal proceedings." Theodore Crane. Arthur Crane's son, or brother, or cousin, the same name as the Billings lawyer in the formation documents. Clara stayed in the doorway and said nothing. Caleb said, "Come in." He came in and saw her and stopped for a fractional moment, the kind that people with practice concealed quickly. He said hello, and she said hello, and they all sat down in the main room, and the 1874 survey was on the table between them, and Crane did not look at it, which meant he saw it. "My client is aware," Crane said, "that there may be some confusion about the boundary lines between your property and the parcels they have registered. They're prepared to offer a settlement that would compensate you for any inconvenience while resolving the question of where the accurate boundary sits." "What's the settlement?" Caleb said. Crane named a figure. It was not small. It was, Clara recognized, carefully calibrated, large enough to seem generous, small enough to leave several hundred acres of Westridge land in Western Meridian's column. Caleb looked at Clara. She shook her head once, so small that Crane probably didn't see it. "I'm not interested in a settlement," Caleb said. Crane's expression didn't change in any way she could have described specifically, but something in the room changed. The particular quality of air when a conversation shifts from negotiation to something else. "Mr. Westridge," Crane said, "I'd encourage you to consider this carefully. The county records support my client's boundary claims. If this goes to a formal proceeding, the expense and time involved—" "The county records," Clara said from the doorway, "support a position that is inconsistent with the original 1874 territorial survey and with your client's own 1877 formation documents, both of which are currently in our possession." Crane looked at her. It was the look of a man reassessing who exactly was in the room. "I'd also point out," she continued, keeping her voice level, "that the boundary alterations in the county record appear in documents filed after your client's company was formed by a ranch employee who received payments. We're in the process of tracing, and that the 1881 revision to your client's property holdings was filed by an Arthur Crane of Billings, who I assume is a relation." Silence. "We're happy to discuss the matter further," she said, "but not on the basis of a settlement that accepts a falsified boundary as accurate." Crane stood. He was a composed man, she gave him that. He collected his satchel without hurry and said, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing exactly how much to reveal, "I'll convey your position to my client." "Please do," Clara said. He left. Caleb was quiet for a moment after the sound of the horse faded. Then he looked at Clara with something in his face that was more than what she'd seen there before, something that had come uncovered when she was speaking and hadn't quite been put back. "You were ready for that," he said. "I had the documents in front of me," she said. "He didn't know that until he walked in." "That's not what I mean." She looked at the 1874 survey still on the table. Her hands weren't shaking, which surprised her a little, because she could feel in her chest the particular aftermath of something you'd done before you let yourself be afraid of it. "I have children in the next room," she said. and evidence on this table that someone spent 4 years building a fraud around this ranch while you ran cattle and didn't know to look. She met his gaze. I'm not settling. He looked at her for a long moment in the way that had no clean category. Not gratitude, not assessment. Something more personal than either. No, he said quietly. We're not. Outside, the evening was coming down hard and cold, and somewhere on the east boundary of the ranch, 3 fence posts were still cut, and Theodore Crane was riding back toward Coldwater with a message he was going to have to deliver to a man in Chicago who had not expected to be refused. Clara picked up her notebook and sat down at the table and began writing the federal complaint summary that Martin Hale had said he'd need to see. She wrote until her hand ached, and she wrote some more after that. The federal complaint summary took her 3 days to write properly. Not because she was slow. She worked every evening after the children were down and most of the early mornings before they woke, while Pete's coffee was still hot enough to be useful and the house was quiet enough to think. But because she understood that this document was the hinge everything else turned on, and a hinge that was off by even a small degree would fail exactly when you needed it most, she structured it chronologically. The 1874 Territorial Survey establishing the original West Ridge boundaries. The formation of Western Meridian Holdings in March 1877, 3 months before the first detectable boundary alteration. The subsequent pattern of ledger manipulation, cross-referenced with specific county filing dates, each discrepancy documented with the original source, the altered version, and the measurable difference between them. Roy Garrett's employment period overlapping with the majority of the alterations. The county recorder's acceptance of falsified documents. Theodore Crane's appearance and the settlement offer, which she included as evidence of the company's awareness that a legal dispute was coming. At the end, she wrote a single paragraph summarizing the cumulative effect, that the alterations taken individually might be attributed to clerical error, but taken together, across 5 years, across 11 confirmed parcels, in a consistent direction, constituting a net boundary shift that would transfer legally significant acreage from Westridge ownership to Western Meridian Holdings, they described a deliberate and coordinated fraud. She read it through twice, changed 4 words, and gave it to Martin Hale when he arrived on Thursday. He came out from Helena by himself, which she had not entirely expected. She'd thought he might send someone. And he sat at the main table for 2 hours with her summary and the supporting documents while Clara worked on the final run of the 1881 ledger at the other end. And Caleb came and went with the specific restlessness of a man who was not accustomed to the kind of waiting that required sitting still. At the end of 2 hours, Hale set the summary down and said, "It's good." "Good enough?" she asked. "For a federal referral, yes. For a full investigation, there are things they'll want that you don't have." He looked at the document. "The payment to Garrett. You've inferred it from the pattern, but you don't have a direct record, a bank transaction, a letter, anything that puts money from Whitmore or Western Meridian into Garrett's hands." "I know." "And the authorization. You have Whitmore's initials and a county margin note, which places him in the orbit of the filings, but doesn't confirm he directed the falsifications." "I know that too." She'd been aware of both gaps since the beginning. "If Garrett can be found..." "That's a significant if," Hale said. "Men like Garrett tend to become hard to find at convenient moments. Is the referral worth making without those pieces?" He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Hayes, what you've assembled here is more organized and more thorough than half the case files the land office produced during my 20 years with them. The referral is worth making. I'm telling you what a federal prosecutor will ask for, so you're not surprised when they ask." She appreciated his directness. She'd been uncertain about him since Helena, uncertain whether his interest was professional or whether there was something else in it, some agenda she hadn't identified. But 3 days of watching him operate through the information she'd provided had settled her. He was what he said he was. A man who'd spent 20 years building land fraud cases and had retired without losing the instinct for what the evidence said. "Then we make the referral with what we have," she said, "and we find Roy Garrett." Hale glanced at Caleb, who had come to stand in the doorway. Caleb said, "I know a man who does tracing work. Out of Miles City. He found a stray buyer once when a land deal went wrong. Took him 3 weeks. Can you contact him today?" Hale asked. "I can send a telegram from town. Do it." Hale picked up the summary again. "I'll take this back to Helena tonight and put it in front of the right people. I want to be clear about what that means. This starts a process, not an event. Federal investigations move slowly. There will be requests for additional documentation, probably a preliminary inquiry, possibly depositions. This doesn't resolve in a week. I understand that, Clara said. And in the meantime, the pressure on this ranch is likely to increase. Crane's visit was a test. They wanted to know if you'd take the money and make it clean. You didn't. The next step from their side won't be another settlement offer. He said it without drama, which was the right way to say it. Not to alarm, just to be accurate. She thought about the cut fence posts on the east boundary. 3 the first time, 3 more this week. She thought about Theodore Crane's face in the moment before he controlled it, when she'd named the documents. I know, she said. After Hale left, Caleb went into town to send the telegram to the tracer in Miles City. Clara stayed at the table with the last of the ledgers, and Pete took the children to look at the horses in a gesture of accommodation that she recognized as his version of giving her space. The main room was quiet. The afternoon light came in through the west window at the angle it had reached in October, lower and longer than it had been when she arrived, throwing shadows across the table that hadn't been there in September. She'd been on this ranch for almost 5 weeks now. She was aware of this in a way she hadn't been before. Not in a calculating way, not adding up what she'd spent and what she'd earned and what the balance said about her position here, but in the simpler way of noticing that a place had stopped being unfamiliar. She knew where Pete kept the good matches. She knew which floorboard creaked in the hallway and to step over it at night so she didn't wake Evan. She knew that the north pasture fence ran lower than the south one because the ground sloped and Caleb hadn't got around to adjusting it yet. And she knew this because Evan had told her after one of his expeditions with the survey maps. She had started to know this place. She picked up the next page of the ledger and kept working. The telegram to Miles City produced a response within 48 hours. The tracer, a man named Dix, could start immediately, but would need whatever information they had on Garrett's last known whereabouts, associates, and habits. Caleb dictated a response from memory that was more detailed than Clara had expected. The cousin in Wyoming, the name of a saloon in Billings, where Garrett had been a regular, a specific description that included a scar on the left hand from a branding accident that would narrow identification considerably. You know a lot about a man you fired, she said. I like to know who was on my property, he said. After he left, I made some inquiries. I wasn't certain the money was the only thing he'd taken. And I found out he'd been asking questions at the county recorder's office the spring before I let him go. Questions about property filing procedures, amendment processes, how long county records were retained before being archived to Helena. He looked at the telegram in his hand. At the time, I thought it was just nosiness. I didn't... He stopped. You didn't have reason to look for a pattern, she said. No. Neither did anyone else. That's how it was designed. He nodded slowly. Outside, one of the hands was crossing the yard toward the barn with a sound of boots on cold ground, and somewhere farther off, a calf was making the specific complaint that meant it had gotten separated from something and wanted it back. Ordinary ranch sounds. The particular ordinary that could become something you relied on without noticing. Clara, he said. She looked up. What are you going to do after this? He said it carefully, like a man checking the ground before he put his weight on it. You mentioned the land office position, the one Hale said he'd heard about, in Billings. Hale had mentioned it in passing in Helena, almost as an aside, that the Territorial Land Office was looking for someone with document organization experience, that a referral from a retired land office investigator would carry weight. She'd filed it in the back of her mind and hadn't brought it up since. I don't know, she said honestly. It's a stable position. Billings is a real town. Better for the children than... He gestured vaguely, meaning the ranch, the isolation, the particular limitations of 8 miles from a town that had already demonstrated its attitude toward her in the first week. I know what you're describing, she said. I'm not trying to push you out, he said. I want to be clear about that. She looked at him. He met it in the direct way he had. Not deflecting, not softening. The specific quality of a person who said what they meant, even when what they meant was complicated. I know, she said. Neither of them said anything else about it, but it sat in the room after that, with the quality of things that have been acknowledged and haven't been resolved. The next development came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. On a Tuesday morning, 12 days after Hale's visit, Clara was at the table with Evan. He'd asked her to help him read the legal notation in the survey maps, the formal boundary language that required explanation, and she'd been going through it with him in the patient way that had become their morning routine when she wasn't needed urgently elsewhere, when a wagon came into the yard. She looked up at the sound. Through the window, she could see 2 men on the bench and a woman in the wagon bed. The men were older, rough-dressed, the kind of men who worked land. The woman was perhaps 50, with a face that had been weathered by outdoor work for years. Caleb came out of the barn and went to meet them. Clara watched through the window for a moment, then put her pen down and went to the door. The man who'd driven had already climbed down by the time she reached the porch. He was somewhere in his 60s, with the kind of hands that had worked rope and fence and harness for decades, and an expression that carried the specific exhaustion of someone who had been running on worry for longer than they were built to sustain. "This the Westridge Ranch?" he said to Caleb. "It is. Name's Harlan Deeds. I run a place about 12 miles north of you. I heard—" He stopped, looked at Clara, looked back at Caleb. "I heard there was someone here who'd been looking at the land records, the Western Meridian records." Caleb looked at Clara. She came down the porch steps. "That's me," she said. Harlan Deeds looked at her for a moment with the expression men sometimes had when they'd expected someone else. Then he appeared to set it aside as a secondary concern. "They sent a lawyer to my place 2 weeks ago. Crane, man out of Billings." "Theodore Crane," she said. "That's him." He pulled a folded document from his coat. "They're claiming the western quarter of my north pasture, 30 acres. The creek runs through it. Been in my family since 71, what?" He held out the document. "Said I had 60 days to agree to a settlement or they'd initiate a boundary dispute filing." Clara took it and read it. It was a formal notice of contested boundary, citing Western Meridian Holdings as the claimant and referencing a county survey from 1880. She recognized the filing pattern, the same methodology, different ranch, same target period. "May I keep this?" she asked. "That's why I brought it." The woman in the wagon bed had climbed down by now, and the second man, younger, probably Deed's son, was standing by the horses. "My neighbor to the east got the same notice last month," Deed said. "Man named Brower. He signed already, took the money, gave them the strip they wanted." He said it without judgment, just information. "He had debts, couldn't afford to fight." "How did you hear about this ranch?" she asked. "Bert Callahan told me, said you were looking at records and you'd found something." He looked at her with the directness of a man who had driven 12 miles because he needed to know the truth and had decided this was where to look for it. "Is it the same? What they're doing to us? Is it the same thing they did to Westridge?" "It appears to be," she said. "I'd need to look at your original survey documents to be certain. Do you have them?" "I have everything my father filed when he established the place," Deed said. "Going back to 71, like I said." "Bring them out here," she said, "or I can come to you. Whatever is more practical." He looked at her for another moment in the way people looked when they were deciding something that mattered. "I'll bring them Saturday," he said, "and I'll bring Callahan. He's been sitting on concerns about his north boundary for 6 months and hasn't known what to do with them." After Deed's wagon had gone, Clara stood in the yard for a moment with the notice in her hand. The wind had picked up in the past hour, carrying the specific October cold that had been building all week, and the sky to the north had the look of weather deciding. She thought about the shape of what she was seeing now. Not one ranch, not two. A systematic approach across the county. Find the properties with imperfect records, plant an operative to alter the documentation, establish a company claim, wait for the alterations to accumulate into a defensible paper position, then send a lawyer with a settlement offer before the property owner knew enough to refuse. Some would sign. Brower had signed. Others, the ones who couldn't afford the fight, or who trusted the county records because they had no reason not to, would lose their land through a legal process that looked, from the outside, like an ordinary boundary dispute. Gideon Whitmore, from his Chicago address on Michigan Avenue, had been slowly cutting the ground out from under a county full of ranching families who had no idea it was happening. She went back inside and wrote a letter to Martin Hale. The letter was 2 pages. She described Deed's visit, the pattern it confirmed, the fact that at least one property owner, Brower, had already settled, which meant land had already changed hands. She included the specific language from the notice Deeds had brought, which differed in form but not in substance from what Theodore Crane had presented to Caleb. She said plainly that this was larger than a single ranch case and that the federal referral needed to reflect that. She gave the letter to Caleb to post, and he took it to town that afternoon and also, at her request, spoke with the county sheriff. Not about the fraud. She wasn't ready to involve the local law until she understood better where Pell, the county recorder, stood, and the sheriff and Pell had the kind of collegial relationship that made information sharing likely, but about the cut fences, the physical interference, the kind of thing a sheriff could respond to without needing to know the larger context. The sheriff, a man named Oates, whom Caleb had known for years, came out on Wednesday to look at the east boundary. He was a practical man, Caleb said, not quick to action, but reliable when he moved. He looked at the cut fence posts, asked a few questions about recent strangers in the area, made notes. Had another call about something similar, he said, while they stood at the boundary. Deeds Ranch, north of here. Someone let his cattle out twice in the past month. He thought it was just poor fencing until the second time. It's not poor fencing, Clara said. Oates looked at her with the direct neutral expression of a man deciding how much weight to give a source he hadn't encountered before. You have a reason to say that, Mrs. Hayes? Several, she said. But they're connected to a larger matter that's currently being referred to the Federal Land Office, and I'd rather not speak about them incompletely. He looked at her for another moment, then at Caleb. Caleb said, She knows more about what's been happening on this land than anyone, including me. Oates made a note of that too, in the same unhurried way, and left without pressing further. She appreciated that. On Friday, 3 things happened, none of them planned. The first was a telegram from Dix in Miles City, the tracer. He'd found Roy Garrett, not in Wyoming as expected, in Billings, working at a stockyard under a different name which Dix provided. He'd been there since the previous winter. He was, the telegram noted, sharing a rooming house with a man who worked for a Billings law firm. The name of the firm was Crane and Associates. Clara read the telegram twice. Garrett was in Billings, living in proximity to Theodore Crane's office, less than 2 months after being the key operative in a fraud that Crane's firm was now actively defending. He wasn't hiding, he was waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't know yet. But the proximity was no coincidence, which meant Garrett knew something they hadn't reached yet, or Crane was keeping him close for a reason, or both. She sent a telegram back to Dix. Stay on him, do not approach, report any movement. The second thing was a letter from the Territorial Land Office in Billings, not about the fraud complaint, which hadn't moved that fast, but a formal correspondence addressed to a Mrs. C. Hayes in care of the Westridge Ranch regarding a posted position in the Territorial Records Administration office. Martin Hale's name was mentioned in the 3rd paragraph. She folded the letter and put it in her notebook. The third thing happened in the evening. She was in the storage room, which was no longer really a storage room. Having accumulated over 5 weeks a rug, Caleb had moved from somewhere in the house, a second lamp, a shelf Evan had asked for, and Pete had produced from the barn with the wordless efficiency that characterized most of Pete's contributions to practical problems, helping Lily navigate the specific crisis of Button's ear coming partially loose at the seam. Can you fix it? Lily asked, in the tone of someone for whom this was not a small matter. Give me a needle and thread, Clara said. Pete has needles. I know, go ask him. Lily went, with the focused urgency of a child on a mission, and Clara sat on the edge of the pallet with the cloth doll in her lap, and she heard from the main room the sound of Evan's voice and Caleb's voice in the particular back and forth that had developed between them over the past few weeks. Evan asking questions about the survey maps with the steady, inexhaustible interest he brought to things that caught him, and Caleb answering them with a directness that suited Evan's style. She sat and listened to it through the wall. She heard Evan say, with the particular confidence he reserved for things he was certain about, the northeast corner should be farther out. The old map says so. And Caleb say, You're right, it should be. And a pause. Then Evan, Are you going to get it back? Another pause, longer. Working on it, Caleb said. Clara's working on it. She sat for a moment in the quiet room with Button in her lap, and the needle and thread that Lily had reappeared with in her hand, and she felt something she'd been holding carefully at a distance come a little closer. The particular shape of a life that had not been planned, that had arrived through a sequence of failures and necessities that had taken on a quality she didn't have a clean name for. She restitched Button's ear with 5 careful stitches and presented it to Lily, who examined it with the judicial seriousness of someone who knew the difference between adequate and right. "Better," Lily said, and took the doll and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Clara went to the main room. Evan was at the table with the 1874 survey and the current county map side by side, pointing out something to Caleb that Caleb was listening to with full attention, which was the only way Caleb listened. He looked up when she came in. "Hale sent a telegram while you were with Lily," he said. "It's on the table." She found it. Short, direct, the way Hale communicated when he had something real to say. The Federal Land Office in Helena had accepted the referral and assigned an investigator, a man named Stoddard, who had worked land fraud cases out of Denver before transferring north. He would be in contact within 2 weeks. She looked at the telegram for a moment. 2 weeks. 2 weeks until someone with federal authority was actively in this, and after that the shape of things would change. The pace, the risk level, the pressure from Whitmore's side when he understood what was moving toward him. She put the telegram down. "We need to talk to Deeds and Callahan before Stoddard arrives," she said. "Their documentation needs to be organized the same way ours is. The investigator is going to see multiple properties. I don't want the evidence to look fragmented." Caleb said, "Saturday, like Deeds said. I'll need Saturday and Sunday both, probably." She looked at the survey maps on the table. "And I want to write to Stoddard directly before he comes. I want him to understand the scope before he gets here, not after." "You can do that?" "Hale gave me his contact. I can do it." Evan had been listening to this with his usual careful attention and now said, without particular preamble, "Are we staying here?" The question landed in the room with the weight that children's direct questions always had, the specific quality of something that needed to be true or not true, without the adult circling that kept the answer at a distance. Clara looked at him. He was watching her with the steady, serious eyes she'd known since he was born, the eyes that had been too old for his face since his father died, and that she'd spent 1.5 years trying to give back some of the childhood they'd lost the right to. She looked at the table, at the survey maps, at the telegram from Hale, at Caleb, who was not looking at her, but at the middle distance in the way of someone deliberately giving her space to answer. "For now," she said. "Yes." Evan looked at her for another moment, checking her the way he checked everything, for the gap between what was said and what was meant. He seemed to find them close enough. He looked back at the map. "Good," he said, "because I figured out where the original northeast stake would have been, and I want to show someone in the morning." "Show Caleb," she said. "He already knows the land," Evan said. I want to show you." She sat down at the table. She stayed there until past 10, working through the correspondence she needed to write. The letter to Stoddard, the organizational framework for the Deeds and Callahan documents, the updated chronology that now included the Brower settlement as evidence of active harm already done. The house settled around her in the cold. Pete's door was closed. Caleb had gone out once to check the east fence by lantern, the way he'd been doing every 2 days since the last cut, and had come back in and said nothing was wrong and gone to bed. At some point, Evan had fallen asleep at the table with his head on his arm, his finger still touching the spot on the survey map where he believed the original northeast stake had been placed. She put a blanket around his shoulders without waking him and went back to her writing. Outside, the Montana night was as cold and clear and enormous as it always was, and somewhere 12 miles north, Harlan Deeds was probably sitting up with the same kind of worry she'd carried into this ranch 5 weeks ago. And somewhere in Billings, Roy Garrett was waiting for something in a rooming house connected to a man who had come to this ranch with a satchel and a settlement offer and left with neither. And somewhere in Chicago, on Michigan Avenue, Gideon Whitmore had received a message from Theodore Crane that a woman on a Montana cattle ranch had refused his money and named his documents and was still, as of last week, working. She wrote until the lamp needed oil and refilled it and kept going. Stoddard arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after Hale's telegram. He was younger than Clara had expected, mid-30s, with the kind of lean, efficient face that didn't give much away and probably never had. He came alone, which surprised her, with a single travel case and a leather document satchel that was considerably more worn than Theodore Crane's had been, which she took as a good sign. Men who actually used their tools wore them out. He introduced himself briefly, declined coffee, and asked to see the documentation. She had it organized on the table in the order she'd described in her letter to him. The letter she'd sent 2 weeks ago, laying out the full scope before his arrival, so he wouldn't walk in cold and spend 2 days getting oriented while Whitmore's people continued operating. Stoddard read through it with a stillness and focus that reminded her of herself, which she also took as a good sign. He asked few questions while he read. The ones he asked were specific and went directly to the places where the evidence chain had gaps: the Garrett payment, the authorization link to Whitmore, the question of the county recorder's active versus passive complicity. The same gaps she'd identified. She answered honestly about each one. This is what we have. This is what we don't. This is what we believe the missing piece would show. After 2 hours, he sat back and looked at the ceiling briefly, in the way of someone adding things up. Then he looked at Clara. "You wrote the summary in my referral packet," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Were you trained in law?" "Adjacent to it," she said, long enough to understand how evidence needs to be structured. He looked at the table. "Mrs. Hayes, I've opened 11 land fraud cases in 4 years. This is the clearest initial documentation I've walked into. That's not flattery. It's a practical observation about what we can move on immediately versus what we'll spend months reconstructing." "What can you move on immediately?" Caleb asked. He'd been at the far end of the table, listening without interrupting. He'd gotten better at that over the past weeks, or perhaps she'd gotten better at recognizing that his silence was engagement rather than absence. The altered county filings, cross-referenced with the 1874 survey, give us the foundation for a federal complaint against Western Meridian Holdings. The company formation documents tie Whitmore to the enterprise. The Crane correspondence ties his legal representative to the active campaign. Stoddard tapped the pile. "What I can't move on immediately is Whitmore personally. Everything here puts him in the orbit of the fraud. None of it proves he directed it." "Garrett," Clara said. "Garrett?" he agreed. "Where is he?" She told him about Dix's telegram. Billings, the stockyard, the Crane rooming house connection. Stoddard listened to this with the concentrated expression of someone recalibrating a timeline. "That's significant," he said. "A man who falsified records for a company whose lawyer he's now living adjacent to. That's not coincidence, that's management. They're keeping him close because he knows too much to leave loose." "Can you bring him in?" Caleb asked. "I can have him located formally and questioned. Whether he'll cooperate—" Stoddard stopped. Men in Garrett's position have 2 choices. They can let the weight of the fraud fall entirely on them, which is what Whitmore is counting on, or they can reduce that weight by cooperating with a federal investigation, which is what we'd offer him. He paused. "It depends on what he's more afraid of. Whitmore's reach or federal land fraud charges." "What are the charges for a man who did what he did?" Clara asked. "Falsification of federal land records, conspiracy to commit land fraud, wire fraud across state lines given the Chicago connection, minimum 5 years, likely more, given the scope." He looked at her. "Whitmore's looking at considerably worse, if we can connect him directly. Federal fraud conspiracy at this scale, across multiple properties, multiple counties, that's the kind of case that ends careers and then ends freedom." The room was quiet for a moment. "I need to go to Billings," Stoddard said. "Today if possible. I want to reach Garrett before anyone tells him a federal investigator has been at this ranch." He looked at Caleb. "I'd ask you to limit who knows I've been here." "Pete won't say anything," Caleb said. "The hands don't know why you're here." Stoddard stood, began organizing his own notes. "I'll be in contact within the week. In the meantime," he looked at Clara directly, "don't let anyone remove any of these documents from this location. If Crane or anyone connected to Western Meridian contacts you again, note the date, the time, and everything said. Don't respond substantively." "Understood," she said. She hit. He left within the hour. The yard was empty again. Pete was visible through the kitchen window doing something at the stove. Evan had taken advantage of the adult preoccupation to spread his maps across the floor of the storage room, and Lily had fallen asleep on top of 2 of them with Button, which Evan had accepted with the philosophical resignation of a 6-year-old who had learned that some battles were not worth the cost. Clara stood in the main room after Stoddard's wagon had cleared the yard and felt the particular quiet that came after something significant had been set in motion. Not peace exactly, because there was too much still unresolved, but the specific stillness of having done what could be done, and now waiting for the machinery to turn. Caleb came and stood beside her. "He's good," he said. "Yes." "Do you think Garrett will cooperate?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. "I think a man who is currently living in the shadow of the lawyer who represents the company he committed fraud for is not in a comfortable position. Whether he's more uncomfortable cooperating with a federal investigator or staying where he is depends on what Whitmore has promised him and whether he believes it." She looked at the table, at the documents Stoddard had left copies of. Men like Whitmore tend to promise protection up until the moment protection becomes expensive. Then they stop. And Garrett knows that. "If he's been doing this long enough, he knows it," she said. "Whether he'll act on it is different from knowing it." She turned out to be right on both counts. The week that followed was one of the stranger ones she'd experienced since arriving in Montana. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. And the nothing had a specific tense quality that was harder to manage than action. She worked. She continued organizing the deeds and Callahan documents, which Saturday's meeting had produced in 2 large boxes that were considerably less organized than her own materials and required the same patient, systematic approach she'd applied to Caleb's ledgers. She wrote a second letter to Stoddard with additional details about the Brower settlement that Deeds had provided, including the approximate acreage transferred and the date of the transaction, which was now documented evidence that the fraud had produced concrete, measurable harm to real property owners. Evan went back to school. There was a small schoolhouse in Coldwater that he'd been attending twice a week since mid-October, riding in with one of the hands-on supply days. He came home the second week with a copy of a survey notation he'd found in the school's almanac and left it on Clara's notebook with the quiet confidence of a child who understood that a contribution was a contribution regardless of who made it. She used it. The notation clarified a terminology question she'd had about the 1879 filings. Lily had, at some point, transferred her primary allegiance from Button, who remained important but had been somewhat demoted, to a barn cat that Pete had named with characteristic creativity Cat, and which Lily had renamed Biscuit without consulting anyone. Biscuit's opinion of this renaming was unreadable, which Lily took as acceptance. Caleb watched all of this from the edges of it in the way he watched most things. Not removed, but not pushing in either. She noticed that he'd fixed the eastern fence himself rather than sending a hand, which meant he'd wanted to do it personally. She noticed that he'd started leaving a lamp on in the main room when he went to bed on the night she was working late, which he'd never mentioned and she'd never commented on. Small adjustments, the kind that accumulate without announcement. Stoddard's contact came 8 days after his visit. Not by telegram, but in person. He came back through on his way from Billings to Helena, and he came with news he clearly wanted to deliver face-to-face. Roy Garrett had cooperated. He sat at the table and told them this with the contained expression of a man who was satisfied but not surprised, because being surprised was a thing that had probably been trained out of him years ago. Garrett, confronted with a federal investigator, his own proximity to Crane, and a clear description of the charges he was facing, had made the decision in under 2 hours. "He's given us everything," Stoddard said. "The payment records, check, cash, passed through an intermediary account in Billings, tied to Western Meridian. The instructions, written, which is something people like Whitmore usually have the sense to avoid, but Garrett kept them." "He kept them," Stoddard said, with a tone that indicated this was the particular variety of luck that investigations occasionally produced and should not be counted on, in a lockbox in the stockyard where he worked, because he said he didn't trust Crane not to leave him exposed and he wanted leverage. He kept the written instructions from Whitmore, Caleb said, from an intermediary who can be directly tied to Whitmore's Chicago office. Not Whitmore's hand, but 3 degrees of separation that all led back to him. Combined with what you've assembled here, Stoddard looked at Clara, it closes the gap. She sat with this for a moment. The things she'd identified in the second week, the missing link between the pattern and the person, had been sitting in a lockbox in a Billings stockyard in Roy Garrett's name the whole time, kept there by a man protecting himself, which meant the fraud's greatest vulnerability had always been the people Whitmore used to execute it, because people, unlike documents, made their own calculations about risk. "What happens now?" she asked. "I filed the expanded complaint in Helena this week. Federal charges will be brought against Whitmore, against the two Montana principals in Western Meridian Holdings, against Arthur Crane in Billings and his son Theodore. The county recorder, Pell, is a separate matter. The evidence suggests he accepted falsified documents without verifying them rather than active participation, which is negligence rather than conspiracy. That'll be determined separately. He paused. It will take time. These cases always take time. But the evidence foundation is solid. The cooperative witness is credible, and the scope, 17 confirmed properties across 3 counties, means this will be prioritized. Yishkiyati. 17, Caleb said. Yours is 1. Deeds and Callahan are 2 and 3. The other 14 I've identified through the pattern in your documentation, cross-referenced with Western Meridian's filings. Some have already received settlement offers. 2 have settled. The rest are still in play. 17 families. Clara thought about this. 17 families who had filed their papers and built their fences and worked their land and had no idea that someone in Chicago was slowly making it disappear from under them, one boundary alteration at a time, through a system designed to be invisible until it was too late to argue with. The settled properties, she said, Brower and whoever else, part of the remedy in a successful prosecution will be restoration of fraudulently transferred properties, Stoddard said. That's not guaranteed. It depends on the outcome and what can be untangled legally, but it's part of what we'll pursue. He stayed for dinner because Pete had made enough and Caleb asked, and it seemed practical. It was an odd dinner. Stoddard was not a man who relaxed easily into domestic settings, and Lily's sustained interest in explaining Biscuit's personality to him across the table was something he navigated with the careful expression of a man who had not spent much time around small children and was doing his best. Evan asked him 2 precise questions about how federal land investigations were conducted and got 2 precise answers. And Clara watched her son absorb those answers with the look he had when something interesting was confirming what he'd already suspected. After dinner, Stoddard left for Helena. The kitchen was quiet in the way it was after something large had passed through. Pete washed dishes. Evan helped dry them, which was a job he'd taken on at some point without being asked. Lily had fallen asleep in her chair again, the sudden sleep of small children, and Clara picked her up and carried her to the storage room and put her down on the pallet and stood for a moment in the dark. She thought about Cincinnati, the apartment with the water stain on the ceiling above the bed, the envelopes she'd stopped opening because she knew what was in them, the specific quality of a life that had contracted around her while she was busy managing the emergency of it. She thought about the platform in Coldwater in September, with the wind and the empty station and $31 and 2 children and nowhere to go back to. She thought about what it meant that she was standing in a room she'd cleared herself, in a house she hadn't chosen, on land she didn't own, and that it felt more like ground than anywhere she'd stood in 2 years. She went back to the kitchen. Evan had finished with the dishes and gone to his maps. Pete had disappeared to his room. Caleb was at the table with his own coffee, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the way he sometimes sat at the end of the day, when the work was done and the next day hadn't started yet. She sat down across from him. "The Billings position," she said. He looked at her. "Hale's referral. I'd have it if I wanted it." She looked at her hands on the table. "Steady work, real salary, better schools than Coldwater for Evan. Billings is a city. There are things there for children that don't exist out here." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it." "I know that too." She looked up. He was watching her with the steady, open expression he had when he'd already decided not to push, when he'd made a choice to let things be what they were going to be. It was not a passive expression. It was actually the opposite, a kind of active restraint that she understood now was one of the harder things he did. "Why haven't you asked?" she said. "Because it's not my question to ask," he said. "It's your decision, your life, your children. The ranch is your life. Yes? If I stay, that's—" She stopped. Tried again. "If I stay, it changes what this is, what we are." He was quiet for a moment. "I know what I'd want it to be," he said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I'm not going to make it harder for you to leave by saying so either." She looked at him. This man who had come to a boarding house in Coldwater and offered her work because she needed it, not because she was a woman alone in need of rescue, who had written it down and signed it because she asked, who had told her the truth about Martin Hale when it would have been easier to let it go, who had listened to her son talk about survey maps with the same attention he gave to things that actually mattered to him, which, she had come to understand, was because to him they did. He was not a simple man. He was not easy to know. He had silences that still held things she hadn't reached, and a history she'd only gathered in pieces, and the particular quality of a person who had been living alone long enough that company was something he'd stopped expecting. He was also, she thought, the person she trusted most in the world, and she'd been in this world long enough to understand what that was worth. "I'm not leaving," she said. He looked at her without speaking. "Not because I owe it to you, and not because I don't have options," she said. "I want that to be clear." "It's clear," he said quietly. "I'm staying because this is where the work is, and this is where my children are settled, and this is—" She stopped again, because the next words were harder, and she had a rule about saying hard things sloppily. "This is where I want to be. That's a different thing from having nowhere else to go. And I need it to be different." "It is different," he said. "I know it is." She looked at the table, at the faint ring from a coffee cup on the wood surface, and the lamp throwing its yellow light over everything, and the distant sound of Evan in the next room turning a page. "The land office position," she said. "I'm going to write back and decline. But I'm going to write Hale separately and ask him whether there's a way to establish something similar here, a formal records function, something with standing, because what I've done here is worth doing, and I don't want to do it informally forever." Caleb looked at her with something that came very close to a smile, which on his face was a specific and quiet thing. "He'll say yes." "I think so too," she said. "He's practical." They sat for a little while longer at the table, without the weight of unresolved things pressing on the silence. It was a different quality of quiet than the early ones, not the silence of two strangers being careful, but the silence of two people who had been through something together and had come out on the other side of it into something that didn't have a precedent for either of them. The federal investigation moved the way Stoddard had said it would, not fast, but steadily, with the grinding momentum of a process that had been properly started and couldn't be easily stopped. Gideon Whitmore was formally charged in December, 6 weeks after Stoddard's second visit to the ranch. The charges were federal land fraud, conspiracy, and wire fraud, 23 counts across 3 Montana counties, with Garrett's testimony and the payment records as the spine of the prosecution's case, and Clara's documented evidence package as its skeleton. Whitmore hired 3 lawyers. They filed 4 motions to delay the proceedings. All 4 were denied. The 2 Montana principals in Western Meridian Holdings cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, which produced additional evidence confirming Whitmore's direct involvement in the scheme's design. Arthur Crane in Billings resigned his law license in January before the disbarment proceeding that was coming could reach him. Theodore Crane did not resign his and was subsequently disbarred in February. Roy Garrett received a reduced sentence for his cooperation, 2 years, which Stoddard had told them was the best available outcome for a man who had done what Garrett did and then helped undo enough of it to matter. Clara did not feel strongly about the reduction in either direction. She understood that systems needed cooperation to function and that the price of cooperation was usually something that sat uneasily but was paid anyway. Horace Pell, the county recorder, was found to have accepted falsified documents negligently rather than criminally, as Stoddard had assessed. He resigned his position in February. His replacement was appointed in March. The 17 properties were sorted over the following months through a process that Stoddard described as untangling, which Clara thought was an accurate word for it, each one requiring its own documentary examination, its own legal determination of what had been taken and whether it could be returned. 14 of the 17 were restored to their original owners through a combination of federal order and negotiated remedy. The 2 that had already settled, Browers and one other, were partially restored through a financial remedy that was not, Stoddard admitted, as clean as the others. Nothing was perfectly clean. That was the nature of systems that had been running long enough to do real damage. The cleanup was slower and messier than the original harm, and some of the harm was permanent in ways that money and legal orders couldn't fully address. Bert Callahan got his north pasture back. He came to the ranch in April to tell Clara personally, arriving early in the morning with his hat in his hands and a directness that reminded her of Harlan deeds, the specific manner of men who had been working hard ground long enough that they didn't waste time on preamble. My grandfather filed that land in 1869, he said, standing in the yard in the thin April light. I want you to know that matters. It matters to me too, she said, and meant it. Harlan Deeds brought his family out in May for the kind of gathering that happened when people in difficult circumstances had come through something together and needed to acknowledge it. His wife and the woman she'd seen in the wagon bed turned out to be the same person, a direct, quietly funny woman named Margaret, who had opinions about Clara's documentation system that were entirely practical and which Clara found herself appreciating. They ate outside because the weather had finally turned and Pete had made enough food for substantially more people than were present, which was his way of acknowledging an occasion without having to say anything about it. Evan and the Deeds' youngest had a conversation about survey terminology that lasted most of the afternoon and produced, at the end of it, a joint project to create what Evan called a correct map of the northeastern county boundary, which Clara suspected would take until autumn and would be more accurate than anything currently in the county files. Lily spent the gathering redistributing food between plates according to some internal logic that nobody had been consulted about, and when Margaret Deeds asked her what she was doing, she said, "Fixing it," with the confidence of someone who considered this self-explanatory. The letter formally clearing the Westridge property of all Western Meridian holdings claims arrived on a Thursday in June. Stoddard sent it with a brief accompanying note that said, simply, "This is what complete looks like," a phrase that she thought captured something true about the difference between a process that was ongoing and one that had actually arrived somewhere. She was at the table when she read it. Caleb was outside. She went to the door and called him in, and he came with the look of a man who had learned not to expect good news and was still learning to receive it. She put the letter in front of him and let him read it. He read it twice, which she'd expected. He looked at it for a moment after he'd finished, and she watched the specific quality of relief that moved across his face. Not dramatic, not the open expression of someone who'd been wound tight and suddenly released, but the quieter version of it, the kind that came when a weight you'd carried long enough that you'd stopped feeling it as separate from yourself was finally set down. "It's done," he said. "That part is," she said. He looked at her. "There's still the records work," she said. "The county filings need to be corrected and certified. Stoddard wants a comprehensive countywide review of the affected parcels as part of the federal remedy, and someone needs to do it with the methodology they'll accept. He's asked if I'll take on the engagement formally." "Formally?" Caleb said. Meaning a contract with the federal land office. My own engagement, separate from the ranch work. She looked at the letter. "It's what I wrote Hale about. What I asked whether it was possible." "And it is." "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "That's good, Clara." "It's what I want to do," she said. "That's different from it just being available." She understood, by now, what the distinction meant to her and why she kept making it. She had arrived in Montana with nothing and nowhere to go, and she had taken what was offered because that was what you did when you had children and no options. But somewhere in the weeks of working through ledgers and county records and the patient, infuriating process of documenting something that someone powerful had spent years making undocumentable, somewhere in there, it had shifted. She was not doing this because she had to. She was doing it because she was genuinely good at it, and because it mattered, and because the particular satisfaction of making the record accurate, of restoring on paper what had been taken, of making the document reflect the truth, was not something she'd expected to find, and was not willing to pretend was incidental. That was worth knowing about yourself. That was, she thought, the thing this difficult year had given her that couldn't be taken back regardless of what else happened. The knowledge of what she was and what she was for, not as a wife or a mother or a woman in difficult circumstances, but as herself. Summer came to Coldwater in the way Montana summers came, not gradually, but suddenly, as if the season had been waiting behind a door and simply walked in one morning. The land changed color and the days stretched long, and the children spent more time outside than in, and Lily had developed a negotiating relationship with Biscuit the barn cat that seemed to serve both parties, though the terms were unclear. Evan turned 6 in July. He spent his birthday with Caleb going over the northeastern county boundary on horseback, an expedition Caleb had offered and which Evan had accepted with the solemnity of someone receiving a serious invitation, and came back in the evening with dirt on his knees and a precise account of where the original stake would have been placed and exactly why. Clara listened to all of it over dinner and asked 3 questions that he answered with the patient authority of someone who had checked his sources. She thought about the man he was going to be, this careful, serious boy who read survey maps at 6 and kept his feelings close and helped without being asked and had crossed 1,400 miles without complaining. She thought about what the year had asked of him and what he'd given, and she felt the particular weight of parental love that had no resolution. The love that was equal parts pride and worry, and the ongoing helpless recognition that you could not protect them from everything, could only try to give them ground solid enough to land on when the world knocked them sideways. He would be knocked sideways. Everyone was. But he would know, she thought, how to look for solid ground. She would make sure of it. The formal partnership on the ranch was not discussed in the way of a business transaction or a dramatic declaration. It emerged the way most real things emerged between people who had been paying attention to each other, through a series of practical conversations that each carried more weight than their surface suggested. Until one day, Clara was talking with the bank in Coldwater about the ranch's operating account, and the clerk referred to her by a title she hadn't given him, and she didn't correct it, because correcting it would have been less accurate than leaving it. She told Caleb that evening. He said without particular surprise that he'd been wondering when the bank would catch up to the situation. "What situation?" she asked. He looked at her in the level, undeflecting way that was the most characteristic thing about him. "The situation where you run this ranch as much as I do, and you've been doing it since October." "I run the records," she said. "Clara," he said, "you run the records, the federal engagement, the children, the understanding of what's happening on this land legally and practically, and about 40% of the decisions that get made here on any given day." He paused. "I'm not complaining." She looked at the window. Outside, the summer evening was doing something complicated with light and shadow across the hills, the way Montana evenings did. That specific quality of illumination she'd noticed in her first week and had been trying to find words for since. She hadn't found them yet. She thought she might just stop trying and let it be what it was. "I thought I was being careful," she said, "about the scope of things." "You were," he said. "It happened anyway." She thought about what it meant that she had arrived on this ranch with nothing she'd chosen and had built something she hadn't planned through a combination of necessity and stubbornness and the refusal to look away from what the numbers said when what they said was something nobody wanted to hear. She thought about the woman on the platform in September, cold, alone, terrified in the quiet way of someone who couldn't afford to show it, and she thought about what that woman would make of this kitchen, this evening, this conversation. She thought she would be startled, and then she would sit down and start figuring out what needed doing next, because that was who she was. That had always been who she was, before she'd had occasion to know it clearly. Belonging, she had come to understand, was not something that was granted at the door. It was not a status you were given by a town that had decided to accept you, or a man who had decided you were useful, or a set of circumstances that happened to align in your favor. It was built, day by day, decision by decision, through the accumulation of small choices made in the direction of something you wanted to be true. She had chosen this, not in one moment, not in one dramatic declaration, but in the 10,000 ordinary moments that constituted a life. The lamp refilled at midnight, the boundary line documented for the 7th time because 7 was what accuracy required, the child carried to bed, the fence post noted, the letter written, the settlement refused. She had chosen this place, and these people, and this work, and the complicated, imperfect shape of this life. Not because it was what she'd planned, but because it was what she'd built. And she knew the difference between a life chosen and a life fallen into, and this was the first kind. Outside, the summer evening deepened. Somewhere in the barn, Biscuit was conducting whatever feline business occupied him after dark. Evan was at the table with his maps, adding notations in his small, careful hand. Lily was asleep. Clara Hayes was not the woman who had stepped off a train in September with $31 and a canceled future. She was something the circumstances had not predicted, and the town had not expected, and she herself had not known to want. Something stubborn and documented, and hers. She picked up her pen, and in the last of the evening light, she went back to work.
Finish this. I just have to weave in the ends and then also block it. Would be able to wear it in the exactly, Vader. Exactly. That was my hunt with this one, because I wanted something that was good for spring into summer when it gets colder, you know? Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Adriana. Yeah, so we definitely did finish that. I still need to not restart. Exactly, Wispy. You got it. It does. It does. It snatches me in. It's perfect. By the way, y'all, it's a meme. One day, Wispy thought I said I had a 10-inch waist. No, it's just a 10-inch difference between bust and waist. So now it's an ongoing joke. But yeah, so we've got I'd say another inch or so to do of this border, or this part. And then we're going to be knitting for a bit more after this.